My name is Marion Wolff.
My name is Sydney Eibschutz. Hi, Mrs. Wolff. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to interview you. I think this is really important to do this so we can educate younger people about the horrors of the Holocaust, as well as both my grandparents were also in the Holocaust.
I've heard about it.
Could you please tell me your maiden name and the year that you were born?
Marion Wolff. Marion Pollack. Pollak. And that's an Austrian name. That's a very common name, almost like Smith. 1930.
Where did you grow up before the war?
I was born in Berlin, and I was there until I was 5. Until I was 6, actually. And we were, in 1936, things were getting pretty bad in Berlin as far as the Nazis were concerned. So my father thought it would be a good idea if my mother, I'm an only child, if my mother and I were to move to Vienna, Austria, where he thought things would be a lot safer. Well, little did he know. So he sent my mother and me to Prague, Czechoslovakia, to wait for him until he was able to settle all his business. He was in the movie business. We had movie theaters, and he was represented what became Warner Brothers in northern Germany. So I was in Austria, in Germany, until I was 6, and then 9 months in Prague, and then we moved to Austria.
So approximately how old were you when the war started?
When the war started, I was 38.
8?
I was 8, yeah.
And where were your parents born?
My mother was born in Germany, in Aachen, in Germany, and my father in Austria. I'm not quite sure where. My mother didn't really work. She helped my father in the business a little bit, but in those days, women just didn't have jobs like they have to have these days.
Before the war, what was Jewish life like in your community? What customs were observed?
Well, here I have to admit that we didn't do anything very Jewish. And I don't know whether you've heard this, but German Jews tended to be more German than Jewish on the whole, unless you were Orthodox or very conservative. So I don't ever remember doing anything Jewish.
Really?
No, except I did go to a kindergarten, a Jewish kindergarten, my mother told me. And there came a time when the head of this kindergarten was discovered to be a Nazi. Somebody found out that underneath her lapel she was wearing a swastika, and so the school dissolved, but the kindergarten dissolved.
Did you experience anti-Semitism before the war?
In Austria, yes.
Yeah.
In Austria.
What experiences do you remember of that?
Well, probably the worst ones were when I couldn't go to school anymore. Before I couldn't go to school anymore, I was placed with 2 other Jewish children in my class at the back of the class. We had to sit in the back, and then there had to be 2 empty rows, and then the non-Jewish children all sat in the front. So that was the first thing. And then after that, when we couldn't go to school anymore, after Kristallnacht in March 38, I was very often stoned in the street by friends, or had been friends, but I was very feisty, and I still am, and I would throw the stones back. There was that, and then probably my worst experience was coming out of the temple one day where I used to play with some friends. I don't remember where, some place there. I came out, and the streets in Vienna are cobblestones, and I came out to the site of elderly people on their hands and knees scrubbing the cobblestones with toothbrushes. And if they didn't scrub hard enough, they were kicked by, there were Nazis standing all around with boots. They would be kicked, and all of this was to the accompaniment of a lot of laughter from the people standing around. And that's something I will never get out of my mind. It was dreadful. The old people, that was my worst experience. And I don't really, and then they, of course, coming home from school, not knowing whether our apartment was sealed up, the Nazis would come and seal up an apartment or a house, and which meant you couldn't go in anymore, and they had taken whatever was in, or they were about to confiscate it. And there was always this anxiety, when I get home, will I be able to get in?
Did your parents feel a strong sense of German nationalism after or before the war?
Not my parents, no, but my grandfather, my mother's father. I never knew my father's family very well because he died when he was 35. My grandfather was in the German army, and like a lot of the Jews, got their Iron Crosses in the First World War. So this is how much they were integrated, into being German.
My great-grandfather as well was fought with the Germans in World War I.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love them.
Were you forced out of your home, or did you voluntarily leave from Austria?
Voluntarily. I went on the Kindertransport. I was actually on the very first experimental transport from Vienna. And my mother returned to Germany. Her mother was living in Aachen. She returned to Germany and tried to convince my grandmother to come with her to England if they could get a visa. Well, my grandmother said no, they wouldn't touch her. She was too old. She was actually 66 at the time. She was too old, and she was very German. Who was going to touch a 66-year-old German lady? So she would not come, but my mother eventually did come to England, and so she voluntarily left the country.
Is that where you were sent from Austria? You said you were sent to
With
England?
the Kindertransport went to England, yes.
And what ended up happening to your grandmother?
She died in concentration camp. Yeah, she, along with the other Jewish people in Aachen, was sent to the old age home in Aachen, and from there they were transported to Theresienstadt, or Terezin.
After the war, did you ever consider returning to Germany?
Yeah, we've been back several times, yes.
Did you try and relocate your friends and loved ones?
I heard that my grandmother and several aunts and uncles and cousins died in concentration camp, and we did go to Theresienstadt and looked up their records and found out how they were transported.
When you learned of the horrific details of the concentration camp and the fate that you escaped, how did you feel?
I have a poem in my book here that tells you exactly how I feel. It's both guilt, why did I survive? It was very strange because my husband and I went together. His grandmother also was in Theresienstadt about the same time that mine was, coming from different areas, and we've often wondered whether they ever met each other. They could have met. Would I like to tell you? Well, the book is just it's a compilation of prose and poetry, and it has different shedding skins of the different lives I've had. And there is a whole chapter on the Kindertransport, and a lot of the poetry is sort of Well,